My name is Madeline Royce, and 3 days before the biggest pitch of my career, they stripped me of everything I'd built. They thought I'd slink away quietly, watch them ring the opening bell from the sidelines. But at exactly 9:01 a.m., the entire stock exchange floor crumbled because I held the match. And I knew exactly where to strike. This isn't just a story about revenge. This is about how I turned 18 months of buried secrets into a weapon that brought down one of pharma's rising giants. And you won't be able to look away until you know exactly how I pulled the trigger. The boardroom at Argento Therapeutics smelled like expensive cologne and desperation that Tuesday morning. 12 faces stared back at me across the mahogany table, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to openly hostile. I'd sat in this same chair for 3 years, had helped architect every major strategic decision that brought us to this moment. Now they were about to throw me out like yesterday's coffee grounds. Madeline. Chairman Harrison Blackwood cleared his throat, his silver mustache twitching with what I assumed was guilt. We've made some difficult decisions regarding the upcoming roadshow presentation. I kept my face neutral, hands folded in my lap. At 42, I'd learned that corporate executioners preferred their victims to make it easy. They wanted tears, begging, some dramatic outbursts they could later use to justify their betrayal. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. The board feels that with $500 million on the line, we need fresh perspective leading the investor pitch. Blackwood's words came out rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in his mirror. Graham Lively will be taking over as interim chief strategy officer, effective immediately. Graham Lively, the golden boy who'd waltzed in from Meridian Capital 6 months ago with his Harvard MBA and collection of designer ties. He sat 3 seats to my right, trying to look appropriately solemn while his eyes practically glowed with triumph. At 35, he had the kind of aggressive confidence that impressed board members and made smart women like me invisible. Graham's background in venture capital gives him unique insight into what our investors want to hear, continued board member Patricia Vance, not quite meeting my eyes. She'd been my mentor when I first joined Argento, had championed my promotion to VP of Strategic Development. Now she couldn't even look at me. We're offering you a consulting position, Blackwood added quickly. Non-voting advisory role. You'll maintain your security clearance and continue receiving updates on all major decisions. Translation: they wanted to keep me close enough to pick my brain, but far enough away that I couldn't interfere with their plans. The consulting role was unpaid, of course, just my expertise at their disposal whenever convenient. I stood slowly, gathering the leather portfolio that contained 18 months of research, clinical data, and regulatory filings. Every document in that folder represented late nights, weekend calls with researchers, and careful navigation of FDA requirements that would make or break our Alzheimer's drug approval. I understand, I said, my voice steady. I'll need a few days to transition my files to Graham. That's very professional of you, Madeline. Graham spoke for the first time, his tone just condescending enough to make my jaw clench. I'm sure we'll work well together in your new capacity. I nodded once and walked out of that boardroom with my head high and my career in ruins. They thought they'd neutralized me. They had no idea they'd just armed their own executioner. My apartment in Portland's Pearl District had always been my sanctuary. The exposed brick walls and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River usually calmed my nerves after difficult days. But that evening, as rain pelted the glass and city lights blurred into watercolor streaks, I felt anything but peaceful. I spread the contents of my portfolio across the dining table like a general planning a campaign. 18 months of work lay before me: clinical trial reports, FDA correspondence, manufacturing agreements, and financial projections that painted Argento's experimental Alzheimer's drug as the breakthrough of the decade. But buried in that mountain of paperwork was something the board didn't know I possessed. 3 months earlier, Dr. Celeste Harper had contacted me through encrypted email. Celeste had been part of Argento's original clinical research team before transferring to the University of Washington. Her message had been brief but chilling. The data doesn't match what they're reporting. People need to know. The files she'd sent contained the real clinical trial results, Not the sanitized version that made its way into official reports, but the raw data showing that our miracle drug had killed 3 patients and caused severe cognitive decline in 12 others. The deaths had been classified as unrelated adverse events and buried in footnotes that no investor would ever read. I'd confronted our chief medical officer about the discrepancies, only to be told that statistical outliers were normal in phase 2 trials. When I pressed harder, suggesting we needed to report the deaths to the FDA, I was suddenly excluded from clinical review meetings and told my risk-averse perspective was hampering progress. Now I understood why. With Graham's venture capital background, he could sell the story investors wanted to hear. A former VP of strategic development raising uncomfortable questions about patient safety would only complicate their narrative. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a contact I hadn't called in 2 years. Laura Benton, securities attorney at the law firm of Morrison & Associates. Laura had helped me navigate a whistleblower complaint 5 years earlier when my previous employer had been manipulating clinical data. She taught me that in corporate warfare, timing was everything. Madeline Royce. Laura's voice carried a note of surprise when she answered. I haven't heard from you since the integrated biosystems settlement. How's life in pharma treating you? Not well, I admitted. I need your advice on a hypothetical situation. Hypothetical? Right. I could hear her keyboard clicking in the background. I assume this hypothetical involves someone discovering material information that hasn't been disclosed to potential investors? Something like that. Nina. And this hypothetical person is considering whether to report said information to the SEC before a major public offering. The timing question is what's bothering me, I said carefully. If someone reported too early, the company might have time to spin the narrative or bury the evidence. Too late, and innocent investors get hurt. Laura was quiet for a moment. In my experience, the most effective whistleblowing happens when maximum pressure can be applied with minimum advance warning. Hypothetically speaking, of course. Of course. If your hypothetical person has solid documentation and a clear paper trail, they might consider timing their disclosure for maximum market impact. Say, right after trading begins on the day of the IPO. I felt a cold smile spread across my face. That's very helpful advice. Madeline. Laura's voice turned serious. Whatever you're thinking about doing, make sure you're prepared for the consequences. Companies like Argento don't go down without a fight, and they have resources to make life very difficult for people who cross them. I'm counting on it, I replied. The next morning, I walked into Argento's glass headquarters building with my visitor's badge and a carefully crafted plan. Graham had sent me a patronizing email about maintaining collaborative working relationships and asking for my input on investor presentation materials. He wanted to pick my brain while keeping me safely marginalized. Perfect. I found him in what used to be my office, feet up on the desk I'd chosen personally, reading through files that represented 3 years of my strategic work. He looked up when I knocked, his smile just shy of genuine. Madeline, thanks for coming in. I was hoping you could walk me through some of these investor profiles. Your relationship mapping is really impressive. For the next 2 hours, I played the part of the gracious former executive, sharing insights about pension fund managers and insurance company investment committees who'd be crucial to the IPO's success. Graham hung on every word, taking notes like an eager student while unconsciously revealing his own insecurities about managing relationships he'd never built. The key with Wellington Asset Management is their focus on long-term FDA approval timelines, I explained, watching him scribble frantically. They'll want to see phase 3 trial projections that show clear efficacy markers within 18 months. And you think our current data supports that timeline? Graham asked. I met his eyes directly. Based on what I've seen in official reports, absolutely. He smiled, missing the careful emphasis on official reports. This was almost too easy. Over the following weeks, I established my new routine. 3 days a week, I'd come into the office as a consultant, providing Graham with institutional knowledge while quietly observing every aspect of their IPO preparation. The other days, I worked from home, building my case with methodical precision. My first ally was Noah Quinn, a sharp 26-year-old data analyst who'd been my research assistant for the past year. Noah had always been ambitious, hungry for recognition that he'd never get working under Graham's dismissive management style. When I offered him a consulting contract to help with external research projects, he jumped at the opportunity. "I need you to keep track of any changes to clinical trial documentation," I told him during a coffee meeting at a cafe 3 blocks from the office, particularly anything related to adverse events or patient outcomes. Noah's eyes lit up with understanding. "You mean like how they're asking us to recategorize the cardiac events in the Phase 2 data?" "Exactly like that. They're calling them pre-existing conditions now, even though the patients had clean cardiovascular profiles when they entered the trial." I pulled out my phone and activated the voice recorder. "Can you document exactly who requested those changes and when?" Over the next month, Noah became my inside source, feeding me information about every statistical manipulation and data revision that crossed his desk. Graham, meanwhile, grew increasingly confident in his role, making bold promises to investors about efficacy rates that bore no resemblance to actual trial results. My second key alliance came through an old contact from my days at Bio-Pacific Ventures. Sophia Reyes had left venture capital to become an investigative journalist specializing in pharmaceutical fraud. Her exposé on Theranos had won a Pulitzer, and she'd been tracking sketchy biotech companies ever since. "I've had my eye on Argento for months," she told me during a lunch meeting in downtown Seattle. "Their clinical trial publications don't match what I'm hearing from researchers in the field. What if I could provide you with documentation showing exactly how far off they are?" Sophia leaned forward, her dark eyes sharp with interest. "How comprehensive are we talking?" "Complete clinical trial data, internal email chains discussing how to massage the numbers, and recorded conversations of executives planning to mislead investors." "Jesus, Madeline, you're talking about fraud on a massive scale." "I'm talking about saving lives," I corrected, "and making sure the people who covered up patient deaths face consequences." My third and most crucial partnership came through a contact Laura Benton provided, Marcus Wellington, managing partner at a hedge fund called Meridian Short Strategies. Marcus specialized in identifying overvalued companies and betting against them, a practice known as short selling that could generate enormous profits when stocks collapsed. "Your information suggests Argento's stock price is going to crater the moment real clinical data becomes public," Marcus said during our meeting at his Manhattan office. "If you can guarantee me advance notice of when that information will be released, I can position my fund to profit from the decline while helping legitimate investors avoid losses." "I can do better than advance notice," I told him. "I can give you the exact minute." "You're talking about market manipulation," Marcus warned. "I'm talking about market correction. Argento's executives are the ones manipulating the market by hiding material information from investors. I'm just providing transparency at the most effective moment." Marcus smiled the cold smile of a predator who'd found wounded prey. "What do you need from me?" As Argento's roadshow approached, I watched Graham transform from insecure newcomer to cocky showman. He'd convinced himself that his venture capital background made him uniquely qualified to sell the company's story, never realizing that every relationship he was leveraging had been built by someone else, usually me. The internal emails Noah forwarded painted a picture of systematic deception. Graham had pressured the medical affairs team to create a revised clinical summary that downplayed adverse events and emphasized cherry-picked efficacy data. When Dr. Patricia Morrison, our chief medical officer, objected to the revisions, she was told that investor relations required a more optimistic presentation of the data. 2 weeks before the IPO launch, Graham held an all-hands meeting to rally the troops. Standing at the front of our main conference room, he radiated the kind of confidence that comes from believing your own hype. "We're about to make history," he announced to the assembled staff. "Argento Therapeutics will be the largest biotech IPO of the year." and every person in this room is part of that success story. I sat in the back row, watching faces around the room. Some employees looked genuinely excited, others seemed uncomfortable, particularly the researchers who knew what the real clinical data looked like. But Graham had created an environment where questioning the official narrative was career suicide. Our Alzheimer's treatment represents a genuine breakthrough, Graham continued. Phase 3, trials are going to validate what we already know, that we've developed a drug that can literally restore lost memories and cognitive function. That was when I knew he'd crossed the line from optimistic spin into outright fraud. Our drug had shown marginal improvement in some cognitive tests, but nothing close to restoring lost memories. Graham was promising investors miracles that didn't exist. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room until most people had left, then approached Dr. Morrison. Patricia, can I ask you something in confidence? She glanced around nervously before nodding. Are you comfortable with how we're presenting the clinical data to investors? Her shoulders sagged slightly. Madeline, you know I've always respected your judgment, but Graham has made it clear that anyone who isn't fully supportive of the IPO roadshow should reconsider their commitment to the company. What about your commitment to patients? Patricia looked directly at me for the first time in weeks. I have 3 kids and a mortgage. I can't afford to be a hero. That night, I sat in my apartment reviewing the mountain of evidence I'd accumulated. Email chains showing deliberate manipulation of clinical data, audio recordings of Graham instructing staff to minimize adverse events in investor presentations, financial projections that bore no relationship to actual drug development timelines. But the most damning evidence was a document Noah had copied from Graham's computer, a confidential memo to the board titled Managing Risk Disclosure for IPO Success. The memo explicitly recommended classifying patient deaths as unrelated adverse events to avoid triggering FDA investigations that could delay the public offering. I'd built an airtight case that would destroy Argento's IPO and probably send several executives to prison. The question was timing, strike too early. And they'd have time to spin the story or claim the evidence was fabricated by a disgruntled former employee, strike too late, and innocent investors would lose millions before the truth came out. The perfect moment would be right after trading began, when maximum market attention was focused on Argento's debut, but before institutional investors could dump their positions. 9:01 a.m. on IPO day. Exactly 1 minute after the opening bell rang, and Argento's executives stood before the cameras, celebrating their triumph. I called Sophia Reyes. I can give you the story of the decade, I told her. But you'll need to have your article ready to publish at exactly 9:01 a.m. Eastern Time on October 15th. That's the day of Argento's IPO. Exactly. Madeline, if I publish a story like this on IPO day, it's going to cause massive market disruption. Thousands of investors could lose money. Those investors are going to lose money anyway once the truth comes out. The only question is whether they lose it to corporate fraud or market transparency. Sophia was quiet for a long moment. Send me everything you have. The morning of October 14th, Graham appeared on CNBC's Squawk Box for a pre-IPO interview. I watched from my hotel room 3 blocks from the New York Stock Exchange, taking notes as he made increasingly grandiose claims about our drug's potential. We're looking at a treatment that doesn't just slow Alzheimer's progression, Graham told the host. Our data suggests we can actually reverse cognitive decline and restore lost memories. It's the kind of breakthrough that comes along once in a generation. The interviewer, clearly impressed, asked about potential market size. Conservative estimates put the Alzheimer's treatment market at over $100 billion annually. Graham replied, We believe Argento will capture a significant share of that market within 5 years. I switched off the television and opened my laptop. Sophia's article was already loaded on the Washington Post's website, scheduled to publish in 18 hours. The headline read, Buried Bodies, How Argento Therapeutics Hid Patient Deaths to Protect Its IPO. Marcus Wellington had positioned his hedge fund to short $50 million worth of Argento stock the moment it became available for trading. Noah had confirmed that all the evidence we needed was still sitting on company servers, ready to be subpoenaed once the SEC investigation began. Everything was in place. All I had to do was wait. I spent that evening walking through Lower Manhattan, past the crowds of tourists and Wall Street workers heading home after another day of moving money around the global economy. The city hummed with its usual energy, completely unaware that in 12 hours, I was going to demonstrate just how fragile their entire system really was. At 11 p.m., I received a text from Noah. Graham just sent out a company-wide email saying tomorrow will be the greatest day in Argento's history. Attached stock option distribution plan for all employees. Guy really thinks he's already won. I smiled and typed back, he has no idea what's coming. At 6 a.m. on October 15th, I positioned myself in the lobby of a hotel with a direct view of the New York Stock Exchange. Graham and the Argento executive team would be arriving within the hour for the traditional bell-ringing ceremony that marked the beginning of public trading. My phone buzzed with a message from Sophia. Article loaded and ready. Just need your final confirmation. I replied, wait for my signal. At 8:30 a.m., I watched Graham emerge from a black town car, flanked by Chairman Blackwood and the rest of the board. They looked like conquering heroes, smiling and waving at photographers as they walked toward the exchange building. Graham wore a navy blue suit I recognized from his CNBC appearance, his Harvard class ring catching the morning sunlight as he shook hands with NYSE officials. The opening bell ceremony was scheduled for 9:30 a.m., but active trading would begin at 9 a.m. sharp. I'd calculated that 60 seconds would give Argento's stock price just enough time to establish an opening value before Sophia's article hit the internet and sent everything crashing down. At 8:45 a.m., I called Marcus Wellington. Are you in position? I asked. Ready to execute the moment you give the word, he confirmed. My traders are standing by. At 8:50 a.m., I sent Noah a final text. After today, you might want to update your LinkedIn profile. I suspect there will be some management changes at Argento. At 8:55 a.m., I watched through the hotel lobby windows as Graham and the board took their positions on the NYSE trading floor, surrounded by cameras and financial media reporters. Graham looked completely relaxed, probably already counting the millions he'd make from his stock options. At 8:59 a.m., I opened my laptop and pulled up Sophia's article one final time. 12 pages of devastating evidence, meticulously documented and legally bulletproof. The kind of journalism that destroyed companies and sent executives to federal prison. 9 a.m. The opening bell rang across every financial network in the world. Argo, Argento's ticker symbol, flashed onto screens with an opening price of $48 per share. Graham raised his arms in triumph as cameras flashed around him. I waited 60 seconds, watching the clock on my laptop screen count down to the moment I'd been planning for months. 9:01 a.m. I hit send on the message to Sophia Reyes. Go. Within 30 seconds, the Washington Post's homepage featured Sophia's investigation as the lead story. Financial blogs and social media accounts began sharing the article immediately. By 9:03 a.m., CNBC was breaking into regular programming with a special alert about allegations of clinical data manipulation at Argento Therapeutics. I watched the stock price in real time as reality hit the market. $48 per share at 9:01 a.m., $43 at 9:02 a.m., $38 at 9:03 a.m. By 9:05 a.m., trading in Argo had been halted, pending investigation of material disclosure issues. On the NYSE floor, I could see chaos erupting around Graham and the board. Reporters who'd been asking softball questions about the company's bright future were suddenly demanding responses to allegations of fraud and patient endangerment. NYSE officials were huddled in urgent conversations, trying to determine whether trading should be permanently suspended. Graham's face had gone from triumph to confusion to what looked like genuine panic. He was frantically checking his phone, probably getting bombarded with calls from lawyers, investors, and board members demanding to know what the hell was happening. At 9:08 a.m., my phone rang. Unknown number. but I recognized the voice immediately when I answered. You fucking bitch! Graham's voice was shaking with rage. You destroyed everything. Do you have any idea what you've done? I've told the truth, I replied calmly. Something you apparently forgot how to do. You've ruined hundreds of innocent people, employees who had nothing to do with clinical data, investors who trusted us, pension funds that put their members' retirement money into our stock. Those people were going to lose their money anyway, Graham. The only difference is now they'll lose it to transparency instead of fraud. The SEC is going to investigate every document, every email, every conversation. You realize that includes your communications too, right? If they find evidence that you coordinated this attack for personal revenge, let them investigate, I interrupted. I have 18 months of documentation showing systematic fraud at Argento. What do you have? A Harvard MBA and 6 months of experience manipulating clinical data to impress investors? The line went quiet for a moment. Why? Graham asked finally. Why didn't you just report this through proper channels? Why did you have to destroy the entire company? Because proper channels would have given you time to cover your tracks and spin the narrative. Because the FDA investigation would have taken 2 years while more patients died from a drug you knew was dangerous. And because sometimes the only way to stop corporate fraud is to make it too expensive to continue. I hung up and turned my attention back to the financial news coverage. By 9:15 a.m., the SEC had announced a formal investigation into Argento's clinical trial disclosures. By 9:30 a.m., the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York had issued a statement about potential criminal charges for securities fraud. The Argento executives who'd been celebrating on live television 30 minutes earlier were now huddled with lawyers, trying to figure out how to limit their exposure to criminal prosecution. Graham had disappeared from the NYSE floor entirely, probably getting emergency legal counsel about how to avoid federal prison. But the most satisfying moment came at 10:15 a.m. when Dr. Patricia Morrison called me directly. Madeline. Her voice sounded relieved for the first time in months. I wanted to thank you for destroying your company, for giving me permission to tell the truth. The FBI contacted me an hour ago asking about clinical data manipulation. I'm going to tell them everything, every conversation with Graham about minimizing adverse events, every document revision I was pressured to approve, every patient death that got reclassified as an unrelated incident. What about your job, your kids, and mortgage? Patricia laughed, but it sounded more like crying. Madeline, I've been lying awake every night for months thinking about those 3 patients who died. Their families trusted us to keep them safe, and we killed them for profit margins. Whatever happens to my career, I can't live with that anymore. By noon, Argento Therapeutics had officially withdrawn its IPO and announced that Chairman Blackwood was stepping down pending the SEC investigation. Graham had been placed on administrative leave, which was corporate speak for fired, but we can't say that until the lawyers figure out our legal liability. I spent the afternoon fielding calls from reporters, prosecutors, and former colleagues. Everyone wanted to know how I'd managed to bring down a $500 million IPO with a single news article. The answer was simpler than they expected. I told the truth at exactly the right moment. That evening, I sat in my hotel room watching financial news coverage of what analysts were calling one of the most dramatic IPO collapses in modern history. Market commentators debated whether my actions represented necessary whistleblowing or market manipulation designed to profit from Argento's destruction. They were missing the point. This wasn't about market manipulation. It was about power, specifically, the power that comes from knowing when to use what you know. For 18 months, I'd watched Argento's executives bury evidence of patient deaths to protect their IPO timeline. They'd counted on employee loyalty, regulatory delays, and investor greed to keep their secrets safe. They'd never considered that someone might be watching, documenting, and planning to use their own arrogance against them. At 7 p.m., I received a final text from Noah. SEC investigators are seizing company servers and interviewing everyone who had access to clinical data. Graham's lawyer issued a statement saying he's cooperating fully with the investigation. Thought you'd want to know. I typed back, "Thanks for everything, Noah. You did the right thing." Did we really save lives by doing this? 3 patients died because Argento hid adverse event data from the FDA. How many more would have died if their drug had made it to market with falsified safety information? When you put it that way, get some sleep, Noah. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. I closed my laptop and walked to the hotel room window, looking out at the lights of Manhattan spread below me. Somewhere in this city, Graham was probably meeting with criminal defense attorneys, trying to figure out how to avoid federal prison. Somewhere else, pension fund managers were calculating how much money they'd saved by not investing in Argento's fraud. And in research hospitals across the country, doctors were learning that a drug they'd been excited to prescribe was actually killing patients. The financial media would spend weeks analyzing the market implications of Argento's collapse. Business schools would write case studies about corporate governance failures and whistleblower protections. Prosecutors would build careers on the fraud convictions that followed. But for me, the most important outcome was simpler. 3 families would never know that their loved ones had died to protect a stock price, but dozens of other families would never have to experience that loss. I pulled out my phone and deleted Graham's contact information, along with everyone else from Argento, except Noah and Dr. Morrison. That chapter of my life was over. Whatever came next, it would be built on something more solid than stock options and quarterly earnings reports. Real power isn't about the corner office or the executive title. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is make sure the truth comes out at exactly the right moment. Graham had learned that lesson the hard way. The question that would haunt everyone who heard this story wasn't whether I'd done the right thing. It was whether they'd have the courage to do the same thing when their moment came. I turned away from the window and began packing my bag. Tomorrow, I'd fly back to Portland and start figuring out what to do with the rest of my life. But tonight, I'd sleep better than I had in months, knowing that sometimes justice is just truth delivered with perfect timing. 3 days after they'd thrown me out of that boardroom, Argento Therapeutics was finished, Graham's career was over, and 3 patients who would have died from a drug that should never have been approved were still alive because someone finally decided that the truth was more important than the stock price. That's the power of knowing exactly when to pull the trigger.